Hello, welcome to Tools for Success, a series about recovery from addiction. My name is Rob Bennett. My name is Dr. Rob Bennett, and I will be your host for this series. The goal of the series is just to really start to talk about some concepts and things that may help a person recover from the traumatic effects of addiction. I am a recovering addict first. I have over 26 years of sobriety. I am also a PhD in counselor education and supervision. I'm a licensed mental health counselor and a credentialed alcohol and substance abuse counselor. I've worked in the field of substance abuse and co-occurring disorders, mental health, for approximately 23 years. And have a wealth of knowledge from both sides of the pendulum with regards to recovery and as a professional working in the field. So usually when I'm meeting with someone and they're in a group with me, the first question that I will ask them is, do we recover because we're strong and relapse or use because we're weak? And I get all kind of different answers to that question. But the reality is that we recover because we use the tools and we relapse because we don't. Thus the name of the show, Tools for Success. I will then have that person stand in a line and I will stand above them. So I'm standing here and they are actually standing here. And so I say, I represent addiction, all right? And here you are struggling with addiction, and I will have the group growl, ah! And so then I will ask them, what things do they need to put in place to move addiction away from them? All right, so let me move to this side. So they go, sponsors, home groups, sober supports, meetings, literature, spirituality. There's a whole list of different things that they have to put in place in order to recover from addiction. So it's never about whether it's strength or weaknesses. Is what things do I have in this place to create this gap between me here, the person trying to recover, and the disease here that's trying to grasp me. And then I show them as how they move all of these things out of the way for various reasons, and we'll get into some of those reasons in further series, how addiction creeps right back to them, or they creep to addiction based off of moving those different things. And then finally I will say, one of the biggest things is they'll leave all of these things, but they will still hook up with Juicy, Jelly, Jammy, Lucky, Charmy, Yo-Yo, Flacco, Foggy, Smoothie, Pookie, Julio, Junebug, the woman with the crooked do-rag and bad hair weave, and Becky with the good hair, and Big Booty Judy from eating all the double portions when they're in treatment, and everyone laughs. But it's a way to get them to remember that it really is about how many resources do you have in place that's going to prevent addiction from being able to grasp you. So, cannot get into really, recovery from addiction without understanding what is a disease or what is a disorder. So, today's session is going to focus just on that. What is a disease and what is a disorder? Why do we call it a disease? Really looking at those different things and concepts, because sometimes if people don't really understand those, then they will just loop it into the category of willpower or poor decisions. And not that poor decisions don't have something to do with it, but this whole willpower thing, and you really can't will away a disease. So hopefully at the end of the session, you'll have a better understanding of why we consider addiction to be a disease. So, simply, what is a disease? It really is an abnormal condition that affects the body of an organism. So that's pretty straightforward. When I say abnormal, in a sense I'm saying it's above normal. It's not the set of circumstances that would really happen and that is affecting this entity or this organism, all right? And it kind of lines up with the disorder. So if you think about what is a disorder, it's a functional abnormality or disturbance. So in sense, it is something that's happening. When I say functional, is moving, is working. It has different components to it. It can be biological, social, psychological factors, and psychiatric factors. So all of these different components is really operating against to cause a disorder. So the American Medical Association Council on Science and Public Health stated this is a disease, an impairment of the normal functioning of some aspect of the body. So impairment really is, it just doesn't quite work right. It has characteristic signs or symptoms, all right? So a sign is something that's obvious, a symptom is more subjective. So I like to use this example. If I'm feeling sick and I'm nauseous and I say I feel nauseous, that's a symptom, all right? It's kind of inward, person really can't see it, or they may be able to see certain things, but it's kind of more inward, it's more subjective. If I'm saying a sign is I see a person vomiting, that is a clear sign that something is going on. So each disease has characteristics of that go along with it. And then it can have be harmful or have morbidity to it. So it really is saying that it's going to cause harm and even death. So in humans, disease is often used a little more broadly. So we talked about conditions. So a condition that causes pain, dysfunction, distress, social problems, and again, death. And that's to the person, and it can be persons that come into contact with that person. So again, causes pain, causes dysfunction, causes distress, social problems, and even death. So we know that we're talking about, a disease, and we're talking about signs and symptoms. So let's transition that to the disease of addiction. So the characteristics from the disease of addiction is really a chronic disease of brain reward. So your brain has certain things in it that cause pleasure. So it's a primary disease of your brain reward. It affects your motivation, your memory, and also related circuitry. So it's a chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. So at any time, based off of multiple situations, you can get some dysfunction in these circuits. All right. So dysfunction in these circuits can lead to biological or psychological or social or spiritual manifestations. So it's kind of reflected in the pathology of pursuing reward or relief by substance use and other behaviors. So basically, say for instance, I'm talking about biological. So we're in the opiate epidemic. One of the biggest misconceptions about opiate use is that the person is trying to get high. They may have had a euphoric experience initially when they started to use opiates, but once you become dependent or addicted, so you got two categories. Dependent is you're not using it in excess, so you may be prescribed an opiate and you're using it on a regular basis, but now you have become dependent on it, and if you don't get it, you're going to go through withdrawal symptoms. Or you can become addicted, where you're using it in excess, and when you don't use it, you're definitely going to be sick. So from a biological perspective, an opiate user, most likely once they become addicted, is using not to be sick, not to feel sick. Very different from using a substance to get high, because the withdrawal symptoms is kind of like having the flu on steroids. So once you start to look at it from that kind of concept, you see it a little differently, like, oh, okay, if I don't use this substance, I'm going to be down in the bed just like I had the flu and somebody just hyped that flu up times 100. Psychological. So it is actually affecting your mental capacity, the way you think, the way you reason about things. Social, of course, we know all your social things are starting to be affected. Your ability to work, your hygiene, your ability to keep family relationships or romantic relationships. It may affect you from a legal perspective. So that's the social component. And then spiritual manifestations. When they talk about spiritual manifestations, and there's concepts about religion and spirituality, I believe recovery is about becoming spiritual and not necessarily religion, but that's another conversation. The spiritual manifestation of it is this total feeling of emptiness. Like you just feel empty inside. And so you try to fill that void up through substances, which is only a temporary fix. So like other diseases, addiction involves cycles of relapse and remission, and without treatment or engagement in recovery, is progressive and can result in disability or premature death. So cycles of relapse, and I said like other chronic diseases. And so if you think about diabetes, all right, and usually the people who suffer with diabetes, what is the first thing they want? Something sweet. They want the big piece of cake. They want that piece of candy. And they crave for that piece of candy. And so even if their sugar elevates to a high number and they pass out and have to be rushed to an ER and get their insulin straight, and they come back to a normal number, the first thing they normally want to do when they get out is have a piece of sugar, something that's sweet. So they may have periods of time where they eat healthy and they regulate their sugar intake because of the chronic disease that they have, and then they relapse. So connecting it to something like that makes it easier for you to just see the addiction process. So a person may get clean for a little while, may do the right things for a little while, but the right thing hits them that causes that craving, and then they relapse. So that's why we call it periods of remission, similar to cancer going into remission or other diseases going into remission, because there can be a period of time where you have no signs and no symptoms, but the disease is still there and is laying dormant, and anything can activate it. So addiction is characterized by an inability to consistently abstain, impairment in behavioral control, craving or increased hunger for drugs or rewarding experiences, diminished recognition of significant problems with one behaviors and interpersonal relationships. So they don't even know or cannot readily recognize that they're having all of these different problems, as you may have heard the saying, the last to know. And then a dysfunctional emotional response, not knowing how to rightly regulate their emotions. Like many other diseases, it's chronic, meaning that it's going to last a person's lifetime. So one of the biggest things that I have seen as an issue for family members that have individuals that come into treatment or the recovery process, and they start going to meetings and things like that, self-help, is that they will say, well, when is that going to be done? Or why do you still need to do this? And it's just like any other chronic disease that if you were prescribed a certain medication, you may need that medication the rest of your life. You know, and the medication for these individuals are these other support things that they do. So it's going to be there, all right? It's just whether that person is going to be on the side of recovery or on the side of active addiction. Usually follows a predictable course, which means if it's not treated, you're going to progress to disability and then death, and it has symptoms. There are concepts about whether it's genetic or not, and we may get into that down the road. There are some genetic components to it, environmental components, so nature versus nurture, all of those different things play a role, lifestyle, those different things. So let's get into treatment, and I think after treatment we'll end this session, and then I will see you again on the next series, okay? So treatment really begins when a person accepts that a problem exists and agrees to stop using. He must understand, he or she, that the disease is treatable and must be motivated to change. Now, doing this work for as long as I have, and being around the recovery community for 26 years, I watched addiction from a lot of different components. I watched people that I came up in recovery with. Some stayed, some left, some relapsed, some died. I watched people in treatment that looked like they weren't going to get it at all, and they ended up staying, and some that looked like they were super recovery, Mr. and Mrs. Recovery, and they relapsed and had just traumatic things happen. So one of the things that I truly believe in is that sometimes we have to allow people to hit the bumps and the bruises that they need in order to see the need for treatment. So if I reflect even on my story, being on the park bench, I had started to run out of the resources to use. I went to treatment. They didn't have any extra beds at that time, so I had to go back. They couldn't admit me to treatment because they had no beds. I had spent all my money. I, was using all the time. Dropped out of school. Wasn't working. And nobody was bailing me out of those situations anymore. And so going down to what we like to call them bottoms, it was all of these different things. And finally, just this emptiness. I just was spiritually bankrupt that caused me to say, man, I need some help, you know. And in the opiate addiction or epidemic that we have going on now, people are often afraid to allow their loved ones to go through those different things because of the high mortality rate. And so the fear that, well, if I just let them go, they're just going to go on to death. The reality is that you take the risk one way or the other. Either you risk letting them go to that bottom and get in recovery, because you're no longer enabling them, and we'll talk about enabling, the differences down the road, or you're going to enable them to use, and the risk of death is still there. So I often say, we're in this fight. If we're in this fight together, where are you in the fight? Where do you rank yourself in the fight? You know, are you a pretender or are you a contender? All right, because if you are a contender, there are certain risks that you have to take in order to win. And so I think that, and this is my personal opinion, not as much as my professional opinion, but it is my personal opinion, that we have to allow people to go through what they need to go through and prepare for death if that's going to be the case, because if we don't, we may be preparing for death and having did our part in it. That being said, treatment works and recovery is possible. I'm a product of it. I went to treatment at the VA hospital, and I never had to relapse, and my life changed. Again, went from a high school dropout to back to school, associate's degree, bachelor's degree, master's degree, license. Now I'm a PhD, published 2 books, went back, played college basketball, respected person in my community, you know, a good husband, good father. So it is possible to recover, but there are some processes and some things that you have to do. So I want to just wrap this up right now quickly, and we'll return to it. We really talk about kind of 3 stages of treatment. You have your detoxification, then you have your rehabilitation, and then you have your maintenance of sobriety. So when we come back again, we'll talk about those 3 stages: detoxification, rehabilitation, and maintenance. Again, this is Rob Bennett. Says Tools for Success, Recovery from Addiction, and thank you for listening.